The sound of distant thunder. Chapter 1: A storm on the horizon. The quiet town of Ashfield was perched between rolling hills, its streets lined with ancient oaks and weathered cobblestones. In the center of town stood a small cafe, Maple and Company, known for its warm atmosphere and the smell of freshly baked bread wafting out of its doors. It was here that Claire Bennett spent most of her days, tucked away in a corner booth with her laptop, trying to finish the novel she had promised herself she would complete. Claire had been in Ashfield for nearly a year now, renting a small cottage at the edge of town. It was meant to be a temporary escape, a place where she could write in peace after her life in New York fell apart. Her ex-husband, David, had shattered her trust, leaving her heartbroken and unable to find peace amidst the noise of the city. Ashfield was her refuge, a place where she could heal quietly, without the pressure of the world watching. But as much as Claire tried to lose herself in the fictional world she was creating, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Her characters were flat, her words stale, and every time she looked out the cafe window at the rolling hills, she felt a longing she couldn't quite explain. One stormy afternoon in late August, the door of Maple and Company swung open, and with it came the sound of rain and the clap of distant thunder. Claire barely glanced up from her screen until she heard the deep, steady voice of the man at the counter. "I'll take whatever you've got that's hot," he said. "This storm's about to tear through the hills." Something about his voice tugged at her, and when she looked up, her eyes met his. He was tall, with dark, windswept hair and a face that seemed both rugged and tired, like he had lived through things he didn't often speak about. His clothes were drenched, his boots caked with mud. He looked like he had been wandering for hours in the rain. The man caught her staring, and to her surprise, he smiled, a quick, lopsided grin that lit up his otherwise serious face. Claire immediately looked away, embarrassed. After paying for his coffee, the man made his way to the booth directly across from hers. He sat down with a sigh, pulling out a worn notebook and flipping it open. Claire tried to focus on her writing, but every time she glanced up, she saw him scribbling in his notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man looked up and caught her eye again. This time, he didn't look away. "You're Claire Bennett, aren't you?" he asked, his voice soft, but clear. She blinked, taken aback. "Yes. How do you know that?" The man leaned back in his seat, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "I'm Ethan Calloway. We went to college together. You probably don't remember me." Claire's heart skipped a beat. Now that he had said his name, the memories came rushing back. Ethan Calloway had been a quiet, brilliant student in her creative writing class. They had barely spoken during those years, but she remembered him now, how he had sat in the back of the classroom, always writing in that same worn notebook. "I do remember you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "You were the best writer in our class." Ethan chuckled, though there was no humor in his eyes. "I don't know about that. I haven't written anything worthwhile in years." They spent the next few minutes catching up, exchanging polite pleasantries about where life had taken them since college. Ethan had been a journalist, traveling to war zones and conflict-ridden regions, capturing stories of human resilience and tragedy. But something in his expression told her that he wasn't just here in Ashfield to escape the rain, he was running from something, just as she was. "I came here to get away from everything," he admitted, his voice low as he glanced out the window at the rain-soaked streets. "I needed some time to think." Claire nodded. She understood that feeling all too well. As the storm raged on outside, they sat in comfortable silence, both lost in their thoughts. And yet, there was an undeniable connection between them, a shared understanding of loss, of wounds that hadn't fully healed. Chapter 2: The Weight of Secrets. Over the next few weeks, Claire and Ethan found themselves drawn to each other in ways they hadn't expected. They spent long afternoons in Maple and Company, sharing stories about their pasts, their failures, and their fears. Ethan told her about the horrors he had seen during his years as a war correspondent, how the violence and suffering had left scars on his soul that no amount of time could heal. Claire spoke about her marriage to David, how it had slowly crumbled under the weight of lies and betrayal. "It's funny," Ethan said one evening, staring into his coffee cup. "You come to a place like this thinking you can leave the past behind. But it always finds you, doesn't it?" Claire nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "You can't outrun it. Trust me, I've tried." Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, but there was something unspoken between them, something both of them were avoiding. Claire could feel it every time Ethan looked at her, every time his hand brushed against hers. There was a tension between them, a spark that neither of them dared to acknowledge. But it wasn't just the attraction that kept them from crossing that line. There were secrets, things they hadn't yet shared, shadows of their pasts that hung over them like a storm cloud, waiting to break. One crisp autumn afternoon, they decided to take a walk through the hills that surrounded Ashfield. The leaves had begun to turn, their vibrant oranges and reds, creating a stunning contrast against the gray sky. They hiked in silence for a while, the sound of their footsteps and the crunch of leaves beneath their boots the only noise between them. Eventually, they reached the top of a hill that overlooked the town. Ethan stopped, gazing out at the view with a somber expression. "I don't think I ever told you why I left journalism," he said quietly. Claire looked at him, sensing the heaviness in his voice. "You don't have to." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I want to." He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the railing of the overlook as he spoke. "It was in Syria," he began, his voice tight. "I was embedded with a group of rebels, documenting their fight against the regime. There was an ambush, one of their leaders was killed, and a firefight broke out. I was caught in the middle of it. I got out, but a few of the people I was with didn't. One of them was a young boy, a translator, no older than 16. Ethan's voice broke, and he paused for a moment, swallowing hard before continuing. "He was the one who convinced me to tell their story. He trusted me. And I couldn't protect him." Claire's heart ached as she listened. She could see the pain etched into his face, the guilt that weighed on him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, offering him silent comfort. "I've carried that with me every day since," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought if I left, if I stopped writing, I could escape it. But it's always there, Claire. It never goes away." Claire understood his pain in a way that surprised her. She had spent so long running from her own demons that she hadn't realized how much they had shaped her, how they had kept her from living fully. "You're not alone," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "We all carry things we can't let go of. But maybe we don't have to carry them alone." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the deep well of emotion he had kept hidden. Without thinking, she reached up and gently cupped his face, her thumb brushing against his stubble. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the world around them fading away. And then, slowly, Ethan leaned in and kissed her. It was a soft, tentative kiss, full of the weight of everything they hadn't said. But as their lips met, Claire felt something shift inside her, a crack in the walls she had built around her heart. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads resting against each other, Claire felt a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that she had finally let someone in, and fear of what that meant. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. Ethan nodded, his hands resting on her hips. "So am I. But maybe that's okay." Chapter 3, A Love in the Storm. The weeks that followed were like something out of one of Claire's novels, long, lazy mornings spent together in her cottage, their laughter filling the rooms that had once felt so empty. They fell into an easy rhythm, their connection deepening with each passing day. Ethan had become her anchor, the one person who made her feel like she could be herself again. With him, she didn't have to pretend that she was okay. He saw her for who she was, broken, but still whole in some way. And Claire, in turn, helped Ethan begin to heal from the wounds of his past. She encouraged him to write again, to put his pain into words, and slowly, he began to rediscover his passion for storytelling. They would sit together for hours, their notebooks open in front of them, sharing their thoughts and ideas like they had done in college so many years ago. But as their love grew, so did the weight of their secrets. One evening, as they lay together in bed, Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Claire," he said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked up at him, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't just leave journalism because of what happened in Syria. There's more to it than that." Claire sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean?" "I got an offer," Ethan explained. "A job with a major news network. They want me to be a correspondent again, covering international stories. It's everything I've ever worked for, Claire. But it would mean leaving Ashfield. Leaving you." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and full of implications. Claire's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. "You're going to take it, aren't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer right away, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. "I don't want to leave you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't turn down this opportunity. It's who I am, Claire. It's what I do." Claire's heart ached at his words, but she understood. Ethan had always been a wanderer, a storyteller. Asking him to stay would be like asking him to give up a part of himself. And yet, the thought of losing him, of watching him walk away, was unbearable. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. "You're not losing me," he said softly. "But I don't know how to make this work." They spent the rest of the night talking, trying to find a solution, but no matter how hard they tried, the reality remained the same. Ethan's job would take him far away, and Claire's life was here, in Ashfield. When morning came, they both knew what had to happen. Chapter 4: The Sound of Distant Thunder. A week later, Claire stood on the platform of the Ashfield train station, watching as Ethan boarded the train that would take him back to the life he had left behind. The sky was gray, and the sound of distant thunder rumbled in the hills, a fitting backdrop for the storm that raged inside her heart. Ethan turned to her one last time, his expression full of regret and longing. "I'll come back," he said, his voice strained. "I promise." Claire nodded, forcing a smile. "I know." But deep down, she wasn't sure if that promise could ever be kept. Their love had been real, but it had been born in a place of escape, a brief respite from the pain of their pasts. Now, they were both returning to the lives they had tried to leave behind. As the train pulled away, Claire stood there, her heart heavy with loss. She had loved Ethan with everything she had, but sometimes, love wasn't enough. Sometimes, the storms of life were too strong to weather together. As the rain began to fall, Claire wiped away her tears and turned to walk back to her cottage. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would keep going. She would keep writing, keep living, and keep loving, even if the echoes of this love would follow her like the sound of distant thunder.